containing an attempt to recover and reconstitute the lost origins of the myths and mysteries, types and symbols, religion and language, with Egypt for the mouthpiece and Africa as the birthplace.
Ancient Egyptians were able to sell themselves and children into slavery in a form of bonded labor. So again, they call it bonded labor slavery. Okay, self-sale into servitude was not always a choice made by the individual's free will, but rather a result of individuals who were unable to pay off their debts. The creditor would wipe the debt by acquiring the individual who was in debt as a slave, or as what we'd say here as a worker. Again, along with his children and wife. The debtor would also have to give up all that was owned. Peasants were also able to sell themselves into slavery for food and shelter. Some slaves were bought into slave markets near the Asiatic era and then bonded as war prisoners. Whoa, let's look at that again. Some slaves were bought in slave markets near the Asiatic area and then bonded as war prisoners. So their status changed from slaves in the actual real slave markets in the Mediterranean, and once they entered Egypt, they were bonded as war prisoners, who, as we learned above, had the same status as royal workers, federal workers in the state enterprises, right? so again, let's continue. He said, not all were from foreign areas outside of Egypt, but it was popular for slaves to be found and collected abroad. This act of slavery grew Egypt's military status and strength. Bonded laborers dreamed of emancipation but never knew if it was ever achievable. Slaves foreign to Egypt and had possibilities of returning to homeland, but those slaves bought from Nubia and Libya were forced to stay in the boundaries of Egypt. That's a strange statement there. So let's read that again. Okay, they're saying that these slaves that who he's now calling bonded laborers, right? Because he's saying that the slaves that was bought in the market was bonded as war prisoners. They became bonded laborers or bonded workers, and that he's saying here that bonded workers are slaves that they bought from the markets, the slave markets, in the Mediterranean, not in Egypt. There were no slave markets in Egypt. These bonded laborers dreamed of emancipation but never knew if it was achievable. But then he goes on to contradict that by saying slaves foreign to Egypt had possibilities of return to their homelands, but those bought from Nubia were forced to stay in the boundaries of Egypt. But back in those days, Nubia was a part of Egypt, basically, okay, to a certain extent, depending on how far back you go. So what this is actually saying is that just like here in America, you have people that come to America from different countries to do labor, pick apples, whatever. They come for a couple of weeks or a couple of months or a couple of years. They get a visa to come, they work, and then they go back to their country. This is what he's describing here, but he's calling them slaves. I mean, I guess here in America, a lot of these people didn't have much rights when it comes to their labor. They would, so I guess you could say didn't have many rights, and if they, tried to organize, they would just ship them back to their country, right? So here he's saying that these bonded laborers dreamed of emancipation but never knew if it was achievable. But at the same time, he's saying these foreign workers had these so quote unquote slaves had a possibility of return to homeland, but those bought from Nubia and Libya were forced to stay in the boundaries of Egypt. And I remember he said, previously about these people that was from like Nubia and Libya, they had the same culture and so forth as the ancient Egyptians. So basically, what we are seeing here is that if you were a foreigner, okay, and you worked in Egypt, once your work was done, they sent you home. You had to go back home, okay. But the people that was from the area, that Egypt had some kind of suzerainty over, they didn't have to go anywhere. They would just stay in Egypt, or they would stay in Libya or wherever. if they were from Libyan, because they had the same basically similar culture characteristics according to what they said above. So this is what we have. So let's go ahead and read some more. The Shabti, the term Shabti. One type of slavery in ancient Egypt, again with this word slavery, but it's again we need to just put a worker or a laborer instead of slavery. One type of slavery in ancient Egypt granted captives the promise of an afterlife. Hubshabtis were funerary figures buried with deceased Egyptians. Historians have concluded these figures represent an ideology of earthly persons' loyalty and bond to a master. Evidence of Hubshabtis show great relevance to slavery, to a slavery type system. The captives were promised an afterlife in the beyond if they obeyed a master and served as a laborer. Again, a worker. The origin of this type of slavery is difficult to pinpoint, but some say the slaves were willing to be held captive in return for interest into Egypt. This is a key point here. So just like how we see that they bonded the slave that was in the slave market, people, travelers that they captured and threw in slavery in the Mediterranean, and then the Egyptians would come and buy these people and then give them, rights, give them a status in Egypt as workers as opposed to being slaves. So basically, they're saying here that these there were people who would clamor to get into Egypt to become workers in Egypt as opposed to having to endure slavery outside of Egypt. This is what they're saying. Okay, these people they're saying they would voluntarily put themselves into slavery. No, they would there were people trying to get into Egypt to become workers, just like how people try to get into America to become workers. I mean, you come into America from another one of these other countries where you have no work here, no work. There's no jobs for you, no working compensation, no kind of, even if you do have work, you're working all day long and you get next to nothing. Okay, so people come to America because they can get better jobs, make a living for themselves, and make a life for themselves. So this is what we are seeing with these people that they're calling them slaves. Okay, because it's amazing. So it says that again. Let's read it again. The full extent of the it says that entrance into Egypt could also be perceived as having been given life. Okay, just like I just stated. All right. So just like people come to America for the American dream, people came to Egypt for the Egyptian dream, a life, support your family abroad, back at home, and support yourself in Egypt, and you would hope that you be able to stay there. But as we, but let's continue. So he says that the origin of this type of slavery is difficult to pinpoint, but some say the slaves were willing to be held captive. Oh, wow, in Egypt in return for it was willing to be held captive in return for entrance into Egypt. Entrance into Egypt could be perceived as having been given life. Willingness of enslavement is known as self-sale. Others suggest that Shabtis were held captive because they were foreigners. The full extent of the origin of Shabtis are unclear, but historians do recognize that women were paid or compensated in some way for their labor, while men were not. Yeah. I mean, these people are amazing, right? So the women slaves were compensated for their labor, but the men were not. Wow. However, payment could come in many forms. Although men did not receive monetary wages, Shabtis were promised life in the netherworld, and the promise could be perceived as payment for them. So Shabtis are associated with the bonded laborer, but historians speculate that there was some sort of choice for the Shabtis. So here again they're trying to call these people slaves, but they're also saying that no, they were actually slaves in so many words. They had a choice, okay, they could decide to enter Egypt and become so-called Shabtis, get work, support their family, and so forth and so on. But so they're saying so Shabtis were associated with bonded labor as opposed to slavery, right? There was no slavery. These people are laborers that went into Egypt. You probably sign a contract to work for like 10 years or 7 years or 5 years or 3 years or 6 months or whatever, and then once your labor was done, you had to leave. Some people wanted to leave when the labor was done. Some people never wanted to leave because they liked the lifestyle in Egypt, so they would try to get a visa or try to stay there or whatever. Okay, just like they do in America. Some people would come into Egypt and wouldn't go, like what they call people here who come across the border without any paperwork. These immigrants, they call them illegal aliens, and they would come into Egypt the same way and try to get work, you know, uh, without going through the natural process, right? So this is what we're seeing, and but here they're doing their utmost to try to make this seem like slavery, right? But let's continue. In the slave markets, bonded laborers were commonly sold with a slave yoke or a taming stick to show that the slave was troublesome. This specific type of weaponry to torture the slave has many local names. In Egyptian documents, but the preferred term is called sheba. These are other forms of restraint used in ancient Egypt slave markets, more common than the sheba, like ropes and cords. So now here he's trying to say he's making a reference to ancient Egypt slave markets when we already learned above that there were no slave markets in Egypt. They had to go to the Mediterranean to get slaves from the workers from these markets that that were enslaved. They would take them from these slave markets in the Mediterranean and bring them into Egypt as workers, okay, and give them rights and a way to make a living for them and their families, right? So, but again, I mean, it's ridiculous. But anyway, let's continue. Several departments in the ancient Egyptian government were able to draft workers from the general population to work for the state with a corvée labor system. The laborers were conscripted for projects such as military expedition. Like I said here in America, if we have a military expedition and they needed soldiers, they're going to draft you. And they did that during the Vietnam War, right? That's a military expedition. They were drafted. Were they slaves because they were drafted? Were they slaves because a lot of them left the country and went to Canada or wherever they could go, so they didn't have to go to, and they were subjected to jail time and all different types of punishment if they actually came back. Okay, so when they put them in jail, were they slaves because they put them in jail for avoiding military service? But anyway, let's continue. The labor the laborers were, cons- were the laborers were conscripted for projects such as military expeditions, mining and quarrying, and construction projects for the state. Again, state workers. These slaves, and now he's calling them slaves again, right? Up here he called it corvée labor. Then he calls it they were able to draft workers just like we do here in America. But he's calling these people slaves now. These slaves, quote unquote, were paid a wage depending on their skill level and status of their and the social status of their work. Conscripted workers were not owned by individuals like other slaves, but rather were rather required to perform labor as a duty to the state. So these were state workers, federal workers, city workers. Conscripted labor was a form of taxation by government officials and usually happened at the local level when high officials called upon small village leaders. Okay, so I mean we have all forms of labor here in America. We have what they call chain gangs in the South where they would you know throw black people into jail without much of any reason and then use them to do labor. Okay, so basically what we are looking at is that the society that wrote this, the people that in the society that wrote this here, they're casting backwards onto the Egyptians their own the way they used to do things here in America and the way they did things here back in the day. That's how things used to be here. But they're casting this backwards to ancient and applying it to ancient Egypt like they do so many other things. Okay, and this is just what this is. So they, based on what we are reading here so far, we haven't seen any slavery in ancient Egypt yet. But let's continue. It says these slaves were paid a wage depending on their skill level and status of their work. Conscripted workers were not owned by individuals like other slaves, but were rather required to perform labor as a duty to the state. We read that part. So let's go to the bottom part. It says, masters of ancient Egypt were under obligation when owning slaves. Masters were allowed to utilize the abilities of their slaves by employing them in different manners, including domestic service, cooks, maids, brewers, nannies, etc. and labor services, gardening, stable hands, field hands, etc. Masters also had the right to force the slave to learn a trade or a craft to make the slave more valuable. Masters were forbidden to force child slaves to harsh physical labor. Ancient Egypt was a peasant-based economy. It was not until the Greco this is the most important part here. Okay, let's check it out. Let's read it very carefully. Ancient Egypt was a peasant-based economy, and it was not until the Greco-Roman period that slavery had a greater impact. Slave dealing in ancient Egypt was done through a private dealers and not through a public market. As he see, he's saying there was no public slave market in Egypt, but above, remember, he had said there were slave markets. You see where the contradiction comes in. Anyway, the transaction had to be performed before a local council or officials with document containing clauses that were used in other valuable sales. However, pharaohs were able to bypass this and possess the power to give slaves to any they saw fit, usually being a vizier or a noble. Many slaves worked for temple estates, lived under punitive conditions, but on average, the ancient Egyptian slave led a life similar to a serf. So here we go to the root of the matter. So we had serfs in ancient in Europe, right? And so they're saying that they call them slaves, but they're saying they live the life of a serf, similar to a serf. Okay, whatever that is. Okay, we know what it is, but let's continue. They were capable of negotiating transactions and owning personal property. Chattel slave and debt slave were given food, but probably not given wages. So he's saying probably not. So he doesn't know anything about that. But so again, it's just more speculation on their part. They're trying to, shape the narrative into saying that he can't outright come and say they weren't paid because he's calling them chattel slaves. But there was no such thing in ancient Egypt as chattel slavery, as we can see, and there was no such thing as slavery at all. Egyptian slaves, specifically during the New Kingdom era, are, are, are originated from foreign lands. The slaves themselves were seen as accomplishment to the king, to the king's reign, and a sign of power. Slaves or back were seen as property or commodity to be bought and sold. Their human qualities were disregarded and were merely seen as property to be used for a master's labor, unlike the more modern term serf. Egyptian slaves were not tied to the land. The owner could use the slaves for various occupational purposes. The slave could serve toward the productivity of the region and the community, and slaves were generally men, not women, and families could be forced into the owner's household service. So, so the slave, the worker that they're calling slaves here, he's saying the slaves and serfs uh, toward the productivity of, they couldn't work toward the productivity of the region and the community. Slaves were generally men, but the women and the families could be forced into the owner's household service. So here, the slaves these people they're calling slaves, their families, they're saying was forced to stay into the household and to do household service. So basically, what they're saying here is that the people they're calling slaves, their families would be living in the household of the owner of the slave, the quote unquote owner of the slave, or the master. Actually, this would be the employer. So the employer would actually take care of the family of the people that he had working for him. I wish we had that here in America. I mean, if I, that I went to a job, and not only would I have a job where I'm working, but the job would also be taking care of my family, okay, and give them jobs as well. But they interpret this as slavery. So I mean, it's amazing. The slaves could serve toward the productivity of the region and community. Slaves were generally men, but women and families could be forced. They're being forced into the owner's household service. The fluidity of a slave occupation does not translate to freedom. It is different. So they are acknowledging that what they're calling slavery had fluidity to it. So it can't actually be described as slavery, but they're saying that it couldn't be translated into freedom. I mean, this is talk about uh, uh, double speak and fork tongue. I mean, wow. So it is difficult to use the word free as a term to describe slaves' political or social independence. Why would that be difficult? Either As far what we know from a slave, why would it be difficult to determine if a slave had freedom in ancient Egypt or not? In America, we know slaves had no such thing as freedom. They were slaves. There was no difficulty in determining their status. But obviously, in ancient Egypt, there was some difficulty because, again, they're trying to cast this back onto ancient Egypt. There were no slaves in ancient Egypt, as we're seeing by the very numerous statements that we made about the fluidity of their status and what their status actually was. But let's continue. It is difficult to use the word free as a term to describe slaves' political or social independence due to the lack of sources and material from the ancient time period. But they call them slaves, but they don't have the. I mean, amazing. Much of the research conducted in Egyptian enslavement has focused on the issue of payment to slaves. Masters did not commonly pay their slaves a regular wage for their service or loyalty. The slaves worked so that they could either enter Egypt and hope for a better life, receive compensation of living quarters and food, or be granted admittance to work in the afterlife. Although slaves were not free or rightfully independent, slaves in the New Kingdom were able to leave their master if they had a justifiable grievance. Oh man, here we come to the crux of the matter, right? So a slave, a so-called slave could leave their master if they had a justifiable grievance. Now, wouldn't that be better interpreted that a worker or a laborer could quit his job if he didn't feel that he was being treated correctly? This is what it is actually saying. Okay, this is because we know in America, slavery, and in Europe, a slave couldn't leave because he had a justifiable reason. Okay, so how could that be slavery if you could leave for justifiable reasons? You had, I mean, this is amazing. So that statement right here, this statement alone, this one right here, proves there was no such thing as slavery in ancient Egypt. This is the proof right here. There was no such thing as slavery in ancient Egypt, and anybody that says that is lying. Okay. Historians have read documents about situations where this could be a possibility, but it's still uncertain if independence from slavery was attainable. Wow. Okay. So this is what it is. All right. So let's do this. There is a consensus among Egyptologists that the Great Pyramid were not built by slaves. According to noted archaeologists Mark Lerner and Zahir Hawass, the pyramid were not built by slaves. Hawass archaeological discoveries in the 1990s in Cairo show that workers were paid laborers rather than slaves. Rather, it was farmers who built the pyramids during flooding when they could not work their land. The allegation that Israelite slaves built the pyramid was first made by a Jewish historian, Josias Flavius, okay, the propagandist. As I always say, this guy's a propagandist, right? So this is where all this slavery in Egypt business comes from. Some first century Jewish apologists, okay? During the first century CE, an account that was subsequently popularized during the Renaissance period, while the idea that the Israelites served as slaves in Egypt features in the Bible. Scholars generally agree that the story constitutes an origin myth rather than a historical reality. In any case, the construction of the pyramid does not appear in the biblical story. Modern archaeologists consider that the Israelites were indigenous to Canaan and never resided in ancient Egypt in significant numbers. So that's the story there. So when we go back to Dr. Josh Bowen and his Semitic slaves in Egypt, this is what we see, right? So let's take a look. Uh, let's take a look at Semitic because according to Dr. Josh Bowen and according to what we just read, all this stuff came from the Bible about slavery in Egypt, and it also came from Josephus, right? This is where it all come from, and then we see that the scholarship tried to align with that and try to, rationalize that there was slavery in Egypt when clearly, based on the article, based on that the article itself, and based on these scholars, there was no slavery in Egypt. Okay, but we hear people like Dr. Josh Bowen talking about Semitic slaves in ancient Egypt, and here again, I mean, we read that last line where it says that these people were not in Egypt in any great numbers, if at all. They were indigenous to Canaan, what they call Canaan. It's not really Canaan, but it's another biblical term. Okay, so this is what we have, right? But we still hear about these Semitic slaves. So let's look up the word Semitic now, because Dr. Josh Bowen uh, said that they were Semitic slaves in ancient Egypt, right? This is what he claims. So we're gonna have to see if this was the case. So let's look at these Semitic slaves. Let's see what the word Semitic means. Give me 1 second. Okay, so let's look at these Semitic slaves that they're talking about. Are these Semites? Semitic peoples, according to Wikipedia. Semitic Semitic peoples or Semitic culture is an absolute term for an ethnic, cultural, or racial group. The terminology is now largely unused outside the grouping Semitic languages in linguistics. First used in the 1770s by members of the Göttingen School or the Göttingen School of History. This biblical terminology, again, here it is telling you that Semitic is a biblical terminology. It doesn't have any basis in in history from a historical perspective. But let's look at it. This biblical terminology, this biblical terminology for race was derived from Shem, Hebrew, one of the three sons of Noah in the book of Genesis, together with the parallel term Hamites and Japhetites. In archaeology, the term is sometimes used informally as a kind of shorthand for ancient Semitic speaking peoples. The term Semitic, in a racial sense, was coined by the members of the Göttingen School of History in the early 1770s. Other members of the Göttingen School of History coined the separate term Caucasian in the 1780s. Okay, so here we see that the term Semitic was first created, okay, was coined, created in the 1770s and 1780s. Then it continues to say that these terms were used, as we are seen by Dr. Josh Bowen and other so-called scholars, Semitic slaves. This term was used and developed by numerous other scholars over the next century. In early 20th century, the racialist classification of Charles S. Kuhn included the Semitic peoples in the Caucasian race as a similar in appearance to the Indo-European. Okay, so we don't need to go any further than that. Okay, basically what we see here is that the term slave or Semitic Semite was first coined in the 1780s, and this term has been applied and cast backwards into ancient Egypt for the populations in Canaan. Because we hear the term. Let's go back to this again. Let's take a look at it. We hear the term, uh, uh, the other term, Semitic languages. Okay, let's where we see some ancient Semitic speaking peoples, and let's look at who these ancient Semitic speaking peoples were. Right, ancient Semitic speaking peoples are proto-Semitic, just like Proto-Hebrew or Paleo-Hebrew. These people are the masters of terminology. Ancient Semitic speaking peoples are Proto-Semitic people were people who lived throughout the ancient Near East, including the Levant, Mesopotamia, the Arabian Peninsula, and the Horn of Africa. Speakers of East Semitic included the peoples in the Akkadian Empire, Assyria, Babylonia. Northwest Semitic languages and Arabic speakers of Northwest Semitics were the Canaanites, including Phoenician, Hebrews, Arameans, modern South Arabian, and Ethiopian. They even have Ethiopian Semitic languages, right? So they have uh, Ethiopic or Abyssinian is a family of languages spoken in Ethiopia, Eritrea, and Sudan. They form the western branch of the South Semitic, the South Semitic languages itself, a branch of South Semitic, part of the Afro-Asiatic language family. So here we see a word that was coined in the 17th century, right, has been applied to African languages and African peoples all over the globe, right? From Africa to the Mediterranean to almost everywhere, right? Remember, so now what we have to ask ourselves is this, and the question I have to ask Dr. Josh Bowen is this. Before 1770, when the term Semitic was coined and was brought into the English language, what were the people in Egypt that you claim were escaping? What were they called? And what was the language that we are calling Semitic languages now? Before the term that was coined in 1770, before this term Semitic that was invented in 1770, what were the people, what were these languages like Canaanite, Ethiopic, Afro-Asiatic, and all these different languages, West and South Semitic languages, what were they called before the term Semitic was coined by Europeans in the 1770s? I would like an answer to that from Dr. Josh Bowen. If you could answer that question, it would be greatly appreciated. Okay. So with that said, people, I think I more or less made my point, and if someone think they could make a correction or they see I made any mistakes, and feel free to make a comment. Okay. But at this point, I would have to say to Dr. Josh Bowen, there were no Semitic slaves in ancient Egypt, and you should know better than that. With that said, we're gonna leave it there. This is Myth Wisdom, and I like to tell you that it takes vision to ask the right question, but it takes wisdom to seek the right answers.
Containing an attempt to recover and reconstitute the lost origins of the myths and mysteries, types and symbols, religion and language, with Egypt for the mouthpiece and Africa as the birthplace. Containing an attempt to recover and reconstitute the lost origins of the myths and mysteries, types and symbols, religion and language, with Egypt for the mouthpiece and Africa as the birthplace.